The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as dozens of royal guards stood at attention. Their red uniforms were pristine, their bearskin hats perfectly positioned. Among them stood Private James Mitchell, a 24-year-old guard who had dreamed of this position since childhood. He had trained for years, mastered the art of standing motionless for hours, and learned every protocol by heart. But nothing in his training could have prepared him for what was about to happen on this ordinary knee. Tuesday morning, before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon so you never miss out on amazing real-life stories like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The palace was preparing for a routine ceremony. Queen Camilla was scheduled to inspect the guards, a traditional duty that had been performed by royals for centuries. Everything seemed normal. The sky was clear, the crowds gathered behind the gates were respectful, and the guards stood like statues. James had performed this same inspection dozens of times. He knew exactly where to look, how to hold his rifle, and when to salute. His family was watching from the crowd, proud to see him in his role. Queen Camilla emerged from the palace doors at exactly 10 o'clock. She wore an elegant cream coat and a matching hat adorned with a small brooch. Her staff walked 3 steps behind her, carrying clipboards and notebooks. The royal protocol officer, a stern woman named Margaret Preston, whispered last-minute reminders into the Queen's ear. Everything was going according to plan. The guards remained motionless as she began her inspection, walking slowly down the line. But then something shifted. As Queen Camilla approached the middle section of guards, her expression changed. Her lips pressed together tightly. Her eyes narrowed. Those who knew her well recognized these signs immediately. Something was wrong. The staff members exchanged worried glances. Margaret quickened her pace to keep up with the Queen, who had suddenly started walking faster. The crowd sensed the tension and leaned forward, trying to see what was happening. When Queen Camilla reached Private James Mitchell, she stopped abruptly. Her face had turned red, and her hands were trembling slightly. James kept his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. He could feel her staring at him, but he didn't dare move or make eye contact. The seconds felt like hours. The entire courtyard had gone silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. Everyone was watching, wondering what would happen next. Then it happened. In a moment that seemed to move in slow motion, Queen Camilla leaned forward and spit directly at James's boots. The moisture landed on the polished black leather with a visible splatter. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Cameras clicked frantically. The other guards, despite their training, couldn't help but glance sideways. Margaret's face went pale as snow. The security team tensed, unsure whether to intervene. James himself remained frozen, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Queen Camilla took a step back, her chest heaving as if she had just run a marathon. Her hands were now shaking visibly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. The royal staff rushed forward, surrounding her, trying to shield her from the cameras. But it was too late. Hundreds of people had witnessed the incident. Phones were already raised, recording every second. The story would be everywhere within minutes. Margaret gently touched the Queen's elbow, attempting to guide her away from the scene. But Camilla jerked her arm back, refusing to leave. She stood there, staring at James, her eyes filled with an emotion that nobody could quite identify. Was it anger? Disgust? Fear? The crowd began murmuring loudly now, speculations spreading like wildfire. Some people were horrified, others confused. A few seemed almost amused by the unprecedented breach of royal etiquette. James continued to stand at attention, though sweat was now rolling down his temples. His mind raced with questions. What had he done wrong? Had he somehow offended the Queen without realizing it? Was his uniform improper? Had he moved when he shouldn't have? He replayed the last few minutes in his head, searching for any mistake he might have made. But he could think of nothing. He had followed every rule perfectly. The palace photographer, who had been documenting the ceremony, lowered his camera slowly. His hands were shaking. In 30 years of photographing royal events, he had never seen anything like this. The public relations team would have a nightmare on their hands. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment. This was a potential scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation. Social media would explode. News organizations around the world would run the story. Questions would be demanded. Answers would be expected. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, Queen Camilla turned away. She walked quickly back toward the palace entrance, her staff scrambling to keep pace. Margaret shot a look at the head of security, a silent command to end the ceremony immediately. The guards were dismissed earlier than planned, breaking formation and marching away in confused clusters. James remained in place for a moment longer, unsure of what to do. His superior officer eventually approached and quietly told him to return to the barracks immediately. As James walked away, he could feel hundreds of eyes on his back. His fellow guards whispered among themselves. The crowd behind the gates was buzzing with excitement and shock. News helicopters that had been filming routine footage suddenly had a major story. The incident would be analyzed, debated, and discussed for days to come. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Why had Queen Camilla, known for her composure and grace, completely lost control and done something so shocking? What could have possibly driven her to such an extreme action? Inside the palace barracks, chaos had erupted. Guards who had witnessed the incident gathered in small groups, their voices low but urgent. James sat on his bunk, still in his uniform, staring at his boots. The spit mark was still visible, a dark, wet spot on the leather he had polished just that morning. His hands trembled as he tried to process what had happened. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from family and friends, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them. Captain Richard Thornton, the head of the Royal Guard, burst through the door. His face was stern, his jaw clenched tight. The room fell silent immediately. Every guard stood at attention. Richard's eyes scanned the room until they landed on James. Without a word, he gestured for the young guard to follow him. James's stomach dropped. Was he being dismissed? Would he face disciplinary action for something he didn't understand? He followed the captain down the long corridor, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. They entered a small office that James had never been in before. Richard closed the door and locked it. He pulled the curtains shut, blocking out the afternoon light. Only a single lamp illuminated the room now. The captain gestured to a chair, and James sat down carefully. Richard paced back and forth for a moment before finally speaking. His voice was lower than usual, almost a whisper. He explained that James was not in trouble, but that the situation was extremely delicate. The palace was in crisis mode, and James was at the center of it. Richard revealed that within an hour of the incident, the video had spread across every social media platform. News organizations from 12 different countries had called the palace press office. The hashtag about the incident was trending worldwide. Royal commentators were already appearing on television, analyzing what had happened and speculating about the reasons. Some claimed it was a mental health crisis. Others suggested it was a political statement. A few conspiracy theorists were already spreading wild rumors about secret feuds within the royal family. The captain explained that James would need to remain in the barracks for the rest of the day. He was not to speak to any media outlets, not to post anything on social media, not to discuss the incident with anyone outside the guard. Palace lawyers were already preparing statements. Public relations specialists were working on damage control, but nobody knew what to say, because nobody knew why it had happened. Queen Camilla had locked herself in her private chambers and refused to speak to anyone, including King Charles. James finally found his voice and asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Had he done something wrong? Richard looked at him with genuine confusion and shook his head. According to every witness and every video recording, James had been completely professional. His uniform was perfect. His posture was correct. He had followed every protocol exactly as trained. There was no visible reason for the Queen's reaction. That was what made the situation so baffling and so concerning. As Richard left the room, he paused at the door. He turned back to James and said something that sent chills down the young guard's spine. He mentioned that this wasn't the first strange incident involving Queen Camilla in recent weeks. There had been other moments, smaller ones that had been kept quiet. A sudden outburst during a private dinner. An unexplained cancellation of a public appearance. A tense argument with staff members that seemed to come from nowhere. The palace had managed to keep these incidents private, but this one was too public to hide. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Margaret Preston sat in an emergency meeting with the palace's senior advisors. The long mahogany table was surrounded by grim faces. The director of communications, a sharp woman named Victoria Hayes, was explaining the media situation. It was worse than anyone had anticipated. The story had already been picked up by major newspapers in London, New York, Paris, and Sydney. Television crews were camped outside the palace gates. Royal experts were being interviewed on every news channel. The palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from journalists demanding comment. Victoria suggested releasing a statement saying that Queen Camilla had been feeling unwell, that it was a momentary lapse due to illness. But the palace doctor, who had examined the Queen just 2 days earlier, shook his head. She had been in perfect health. Creating a false medical excuse could backfire if the truth emerged later. Another advisor suggested claiming it was a security response, that the Queen had seen something suspicious. But security footage showed nothing unusual. That explanation would raise more questions than it answered. The King's private secretary, an elderly man named Sir Edmund Walsh, spoke up. He had served the royal family for 40 years and had navigated countless scandals and crises. He suggested that they needed to understand what actually happened before they could craft any response. They needed to speak with Queen Camilla directly, no matter how reluctant she was to talk. Without the truth, any statement they released would be speculation. Speculation could be dangerous. The meeting was interrupted by a knock on the door. A young assistant entered nervously, carrying a tablet. She had been monitoring social media and had found something concerning. She played a video that someone in the crowd had captured. It was taken from a different angle than most of the other footage, and it showed something that the other videos had missed. Just before Queen Camilla had spit at James, she had been looking at something. Her eyes had focused on a specific point. Her entire demeanor had changed in that instant. The advisors leaned forward, watching the video carefully. Victoria asked the assistant to replay it in slow motion. They watched as Queen Camilla walked calmly down the line of guards, then suddenly stopped. Her eyes widened slightly. She stared at something near James's uniform. Then her expression shifted from surprise to what looked like horror, then to anger, and finally to the moment when she lost control. Whatever she had seen had triggered an intense emotional reaction, one so powerful that it had overridden years of royal training and public discipline. Sir Edmund requested that the video be sent to his secure email immediately. This changed everything. Queen Camilla hadn't simply lost control for no reason. Something specific had triggered her reaction. If they could identify what she had seen, they might be able to understand what had happened. More importantly, they might be able to explain it to the public in a way that would make sense. The question now was whether Queen Camilla would be willing to tell them what that trigger had been. Back in the barracks, James received a message on his official palace communication device. He was to report to the private secretary's office in 1 hour. He should wear his full uniform, including all medals and insignia. The message was formal and gave no explanation, but James understood its significance. They wanted to examine his uniform carefully. They were looking for something, though he had no idea what. He stood up and began preparing himself, checking every button, every badge, every detail of his uniform. Somewhere in what he was wearing, there was an answer to the mystery. He just had to find it before the meeting. James stood in front of the full-length mirror in the barracks bathroom, examining every inch of his uniform. His red tunic was spotless, pressed with military precision. His black trousers had razor-sharp creases. His boots, despite the incident, still gleamed. He touched each of his medals, earned through years of dedicated service. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing looked unusual or inappropriate. Yet Queen Camilla had seen something that had triggered such an extreme reaction. What could it possibly be? Other guards walked past him, some offering sympathetic looks, others simply curious. Thomas, his closest friend in the regiment, stopped beside him. Thomas had been standing just 3 positions away during the inspection and had witnessed everything. He suggested that maybe it wasn't about the uniform at all. Maybe the Queen had been having a personal crisis. Something completely unrelated to James. Maybe he had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The hour passed slowly. James made his way through the palace corridors, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Servants and staff members who usually greeted him cheerfully now looked away awkwardly. The incident had made him infamous throughout the palace. He arrived at Sir Edmund's office exactly on time and knocked 3 times, as protocol demanded. A voice called him in, and he entered to find not just Sir Edmund, but also Margaret, Victoria, and Captain Thornton. This was more serious than he had anticipated. Sir Edmund gestured to a chair in the center of the room. James sat down, feeling like he was on trial despite being told he had done nothing wrong. Margaret sat across from him, her expression softer than it had been during the inspection. She explained that they needed his help to understand what had happened. They needed him to describe everything he remembered about the moments before the incident. Every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, could be important. James took a deep breath and began recounting the morning. He had woken at 5, as usual. He had showered, shaved, and dressed with extra care because his family was watching. He described his breakfast, his journey to the courtyard, his position in the line. He explained that he had been feeling confident and proud. Nothing had seemed wrong. He had noticed the queen approaching, had maintained his posture, had kept his eyes forward. Then she had stopped in front of him, and everything had changed. Victoria interrupted with a specific question. Had he been wearing anything unusual that day? Anything that wasn't standard issue? James thought carefully. His medals were all legitimate, earned through service. His uniform was regulation. His boots were standard. Then he paused. There was one thing, something so small he had almost forgotten about it. He reached up and touched his collar. Pinned there, barely visible, was a tiny lapel pin. It was silver, no bigger than a fingernail, shaped like a small flower. He had forgotten he was even wearing it. The room went completely silent. Every eye fixed on the pin. Margaret leaned forward, her face pale. She asked James to describe the pin in detail. Where had he gotten it? Why was he wearing it? James explained that it had been a gift from his grandmother just before she passed away 6 months ago. She had given it to him on her deathbed, making him promise to wear it for his first royal inspection after her death. The pin had belonged to her own mother, making it a family heirloom. It was a silver forget-me-not flower, a symbol of remembrance and love. Sir Edmund stood up abruptly and walked to the window. His hands were clasped behind his back and his shoulders were tense. He stood there for a long moment before turning back to the room. His voice was quiet when he spoke, but every word carried weight. He asked James if his grandmother's maiden name had been Eleanor Hartley. James's eyes widened in surprise. How could Sir Edmund possibly know that? He confirmed that yes, that had been her name. She had worked in London for many years before moving to the countryside to raise her family. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. Victoria looked down at her notes, her expression troubled. Captain Thornton cleared his throat uncomfortably. James looked from face to face, confusion growing. What did his grandmother's name have to do with anything? Why did everyone suddenly look so uncomfortable? Sir Edmund returned to his seat and folded his hands on the desk. He explained that they needed to tell James something, a piece of history that was not widely known, something that the palace had kept quiet for decades. Eleanor Hartley, James's great-grandmother, had worked at Buckingham Palace in the early 1970s. She had been a lady's maid, one of the most trusted positions in the household. She had served various members of the royal family with distinction for nearly 15 years. But then, suddenly, and without explanation, she had been dismissed. No official reason was ever given. She was simply told to leave and never return. Her pension was paid, but she was forbidden from speaking about her time at the palace. She had signed confidentiality agreements that were unusual even for palace staff. James felt his world tilting. His grandmother had never spoken much about her time in London. Whenever the family had asked, she would change the subject or say only that she had worked in service for a while. She had kept the forget-me-not pin in a small box, treasured but never worn. Now it made sense why she had been so emotional when giving it to him, why she had made him promise to wear it. But what had happened all those years ago? What had caused her sudden dismissal? Sir Edmund continued carefully. The palace records from that time were incomplete, as many documents had been destroyed or lost over the years. But there were rumors, stories that had been passed down among long-serving staff members. Eleanor Hartley had witnessed something, some incident involving a member of the royal family. The exact details were unclear. But whatever she had seen had been significant enough that the family had wanted to ensure her silence. She had been paid well to leave and to never speak of what she knew. Margaret added that Queen Camilla, who was not yet part of the royal family at that time, had been a frequent visitor to the palace in the early 70s. She had been friends with several members of the family and had attended many private functions. It was possible, even likely, that Eleanor and Camilla had crossed paths during that period. The forget-me-not pin that James was wearing might have been something Queen Camilla recognized, something that brought back memories she had long tried to forget. Victoria pulled out her tablet and showed James the slow-motion video from the crowd. She paused it at the exact moment when Queen Camilla's expression had changed. At that angle, the pin was barely visible, but just catching the light. It was the precise moment when the Queen had noticed it. Whatever connection existed between that pin, Eleanor Hartley, and Queen Camilla was powerful enough to shatter decades of royal composure. The question now was what exactly had happened back in 1973 that could cause such a reaction. Captain Thornton spoke for the first time since James had entered the room. He explained that James was now in possession of information that was potentially very sensitive. The palace needed to understand the full story before deciding how to proceed. They needed to speak with Queen Camilla and convince her to explain what had happened. But they also needed to respect that whatever had occurred might be deeply personal and painful. James was asked to remain available, but to continue keeping silent about the incident. The investigation was far from over, and the truth, when it emerged, might surprise everyone. The palace was unusually quiet that evening. Staff members moved through the corridors like ghosts, speaking in whispers. The usual evening activities had been cancelled. King Charles had returned from his scheduled appearances and gone directly to Queen Camilla's private chambers. He had been in there for over an hour, and nobody knew what was being discussed. Security had been doubled around that wing of the palace, ensuring complete privacy. Whatever conversation was happening behind those doors would determine how the palace handled this crisis. James returned to the barracks but found no peace there. His phone continued to buzz with messages and calls. His mother had left 6 voicemails, frantic with worry. His father had sent a text saying simply that the family supported him no matter what. His younger sister had forwarded dozens of social media posts about the incident, each one more speculative than the last. Some people were calling for James to be fired. Others were defending him. A few were creating elaborate conspiracy theories. The internet had become a battlefield. James was at the center of it. Thomas sat with him in the common room after most of the other guards had gone to bed. They spoke quietly about the meeting, about what Sir Edmund had revealed. Thomas couldn't believe that. James's great-grandmother had worked at the palace and had been dismissed under mysterious circumstances. He suggested that maybe James should try to find out more about Eleanor's time there. Perhaps there were other family members who knew something, old letters or diaries that might contain clues. James realized his grandfather might know something. Eleanor's husband had passed away just a year ago, but before that, he might have known the truth. James called his mother despite the late hour. She answered immediately, her voice tight with concern. He asked her about Eleanor, about her time at the palace, about why she had left. His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she admitted that she had always wondered about that herself. Eleanor had been secretive about her years in London. She had kept a box of mementos from that time, but she had never shown them to anyone. After Eleanor's death, James's mother had inherited the box but had never opened it, respecting her mother's privacy even after death. She promised to bring the box to James the next day. Meanwhile, in Queen Camilla's chambers, a different conversation was unfolding. King Charles sat beside his wife on the edge of the bed, holding her hand. Her face was streaked with tears, her usual composure completely shattered. She had spent the last several hours in a state of shock, reliving memories she had buried for over 50 years. The forget-me-not pin had been like a key, unlocking a door she had sealed shut long ago. Now everything was flooding back. She couldn't stop the memories from overwhelming her. Charles listened as Camilla finally began to speak. Her voice was hoarse from crying, barely above a whisper. She told him about the spring of 1973, when she had been a young woman, full of life and hope. She had been invited to a private party at the palace, one of many social events she attended in those days. She had been excited, dressed in her finest clothes, eager to make connections and enjoy herself. But that night had changed everything. Something had happened at that party, something that had haunted her ever since. She described a young lady's maid named Eleanor, who had been working that night, serving drinks and ensuring the guests were comfortable. Eleanor had been kind, professional, and attentive. But she had also witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. Camilla's voice broke as she described the incident. There had been a man at the party, someone powerful and well-connected. He had been drinking heavily and had become aggressive. He had cornered Camilla in a quiet corridor away from the other guests. What happened next had been terrifying and traumatic. Eleanor had heard Camilla's distress and had come to investigate. She had found the man forcing himself on Camilla, who was struggling to break free. Eleanor had immediately intervened, pulling the man away and helping Camilla escape to a private room. Eleanor had then reported the incident to the senior household staff. But instead of the man being held accountable, the palace had gone into protection mode. The man was too important, too connected. His reputation could not be tarnished. So the incident was covered up, swept under the carpet as if it had never happened. Eleanor had been offered a substantial sum of money to leave her position and sign a confidentiality agreement. She had been told that if she ever spoke about what she had witnessed, she would face serious legal consequences. Eleanor had been heartbroken. She loved her job and had served the family faithfully. But she had no choice. She had taken the money, signed the papers, and left London forever. She had kept the forget-me-not pin as a reminder of that night, a symbol of the truth that had been silenced. Camilla had tried to forget, had buried the trauma deep inside, had moved on with her life. But she had never truly healed. King Charles sat in stunned silence. His wife had never told him this story. She had carried this burden alone for decades. He held her closer as she continued. She explained that seeing the pin that morning had brought everything back in an instant. The courtyard, the guards, the ceremony. It had all disappeared. Suddenly she was back in that corridor, feeling helpless and violated. The pin had been a message from the past. A reminder that Eleanor had known the truth, had witnessed her trauma, had tried to help her. And in that moment of overwhelming emotion, Camilla had lost all control. Charles understood now that this was bigger than a simple breach of protocol. This was about trauma, about cover-ups, about powerful institutions protecting their own at the expense of victims. This was about a woman who had suffered in silence and a maid who had been silenced for trying to help. This was about a young guard who was unknowingly wearing a symbol of that injustice. Charles knew that they faced an impossible choice. They could continue the cover-up, release some vague statement, and hope the story faded. Or they could tell the truth and face the consequences. Camilla looked at her husband with red, exhausted eyes. She told him that she was tired of hiding, tired of carrying the shame of something that had never been her fault. She wanted to explain what had happened, wanted to honor Eleanor's memory by finally speaking the truth. But she was also afraid. Afraid of the judgment, the speculation, the questions. Afraid of how the public would react. Afraid of what it would mean for the monarchy. Charles squeezed her hand and told her that whatever she decided, he would support her. But the decision had to be hers. In the early hours of the morning, Sir Edmund received a call from King Charles. The conversation was brief but significant. The king requested an emergency meeting with the senior advisors for 8 o'clock that morning. Queen Camilla would be attending, and she had something she wanted to say. Sir Edmund understood immediately that everything was about to change. He began making calls, waking up Victoria, Margaret, and the others. By dawn, the palace was buzzing with activity again. Staff members prepared the conference room. Security was briefed. And somewhere in the barracks, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the new day would bring and whether the truth, whatever it was would finally come to light. The conference room was filled with tension when Queen Camilla entered at precisely 8 o'clock. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry except her wedding ring, and her hair was pulled back in a plain style. Her face showed the strain of a sleepless night, but her posture was strong. King Charles walked beside her, his hand gently touching her back in support. The advisors rose from their seats respectfully, but their expressions revealed their nervousness. Nobody knew what the Queen was about to say. They all sensed it would be significant. Camilla sat at the head of the table and looked around at each person present. Margaret, Victoria, Sir Edmund, Captain Thornton, and several other senior staff members waited in silence. The Queen took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was steady, though quiet. She thanked them for their service and their discretion over the years. She acknowledged that what she was about to share would be difficult to hear and even more difficult to manage. But she had made her decision. The time for silence had ended. She told them the entire story, leaving nothing out. She described the party in 1973, the assault, Eleanor's intervention, and the subsequent cover-up. She explained how she had been young and powerless, how she had been told to forget about it for the good of everyone involved. She described the years of therapy, the nightmares, the way she had built walls around that memory to survive. And she explained how seeing the forget-me-not pin had shattered those walls in an instant, causing her to lose control in a way she never had before. The room was absolutely silent when she finished. Margaret had tears in her eyes. Victoria sat frozen, her pen hovering over her untouched notepad. Sir Edmund looked older than he had the day before, the weight of decades of palace secrets visible on his face. Captain Thornton stared at his hands, processing the revelation that one of his guards had unknowingly triggered such a profound reaction. King Charles sat beside his wife, his face grave but supportive. Victoria was the first to speak. Her voice was professional but gentle. She explained that this changed everything about how they would handle the situation. This was no longer about managing a public relations crisis. This was about addressing a historical injustice and supporting a survivor of assault. She suggested that Queen Camilla consider making a public statement, but one that she was comfortable with. They could control the narrative by telling the truth on their terms. Rather than letting speculation and rumors dominate the conversation, Queen Camilla nodded slowly. She had expected this recommendation. She asked about James, the young guard who had innocently worn his great-grandmother's pin. She wanted to meet him, to apologize for her reaction, to explain why it had happened. She also wanted to honor Eleanor's memory properly. Margaret agreed that meeting James would be important, but suggested they first speak with him about what his family knew. The box that his mother was bringing might contain information that would help them understand Eleanor's perspective on the events. Sir Edmund raised a difficult question. If Queen Camilla decided to go public with her story, they needed to consider the implications. The man who had assaulted her was long dead, having passed away nearly 20 years ago. But his family was still prominent, still influential. There would be denials, accusations that the Queen was lying or misremembering. There would be a media frenzy that could last for months. The monarchy itself might face criticism for the original cover-up. They needed to be prepared for all of this. Camilla met his gaze steadily. She understood the risks. She had spent the entire night weighing them. But she kept coming back to the same thought. How many other women had been silenced over the years? How many Eleanor Hartleys had lost their positions for trying to do the right thing? How many victims had been told to forget, to move on, to protect powerful men at the expense of their own healing? If she stayed silent now, she would be perpetuating that same system. Her position as queen gave her a platform that most survivors never had. She felt obligated to use it. King Charles spoke up, his voice firm. He told the advisors that he fully supported his wife's decision to tell her story. He acknowledged that it would be challenging for the monarchy, but he believed it was the right thing to do. The royal family had made mistakes in the past, and this was an opportunity to acknowledge those mistakes and commit to doing better. He asked Victoria to begin drafting a statement that Queen Camilla could review and approve. It needed to be honest, clear, and compassionate. At 9 o'clock, James was summoned to a different office in the palace. His mother had arrived with the box of Eleanor's belongings. and they were asked to go through it together with Margaret and Queen Camilla present. James's hand shook as he opened the old cardboard box. Inside were photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, and several small items wrapped in tissue paper. His mother picked up a black and white photograph of a young Eleanor in her maid's uniform, standing proudly in front of Buckingham Palace. She looked so young, so hopeful. Beneath the photographs were letters. Some were from Eleanor to her husband, written during her time at the palace. They described her work, her pride in serving the royal family, her excitement about the grand events she witnessed. But then the tone changed. One letter, dated April 1973, was different. Eleanor wrote about feeling troubled, about witnessing something that had disturbed her deeply. She didn't describe the incident in detail, probably aware that letters could be read by others. But she wrote about making a difficult choice, about speaking up, even though it might cost her everything. Another letter, written just weeks later, revealed Eleanor's heartbreak at being dismissed. She wrote about the confidentiality agreement, about the money she had been given, about the lawyers who had explained that she could never speak about what she had seen. She wrote about a young woman at the party who had been hurt, a woman whose distress had prompted Eleanor to act. She wrote about her regret that the system had protected the aggressor instead of the victim. She wrote about keeping the forget-me-not pin as a reminder to never forget what had happened. Even if she could never speak of it, Queen Camilla read the letters with tears streaming down her face. Here was confirmation, in Eleanor's own handwriting, of everything she had experienced. Eleanor had understood. Eleanor had cared. Eleanor had paid a price for trying to help. Camilla looked at James and his mother through her tears. She told them that Eleanor had been brave and compassionate, that she had been a true hero who had received no recognition for her courage. She apologized for what had happened to Eleanor, for the injustice of her dismissal, for the decades of enforced silence. James didn't know what to say. His great-grandmother, the quiet woman who had lived simply and never spoken of her past, had been involved in something momentous. She had witnessed a crime and had been punished for doing the right thing. The forget-me-not pin suddenly meant so much more. It wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a symbol of resistance, of memory, of refusing to let the truth disappear completely. Eleanor had given it to him, knowing that one day it might return to the palace, might be seen by someone who remembered, might finally prompt the truth to emerge. Queen Camilla asked James if she could keep one of Eleanor's letters, the one where she wrote about the young woman at the party. James agreed immediately. Camilla explained that she wanted to include Eleanor's story when she told her own. Eleanor deserved to be remembered not as a dismissed servant, but as a woman of integrity who had stood up for what was right. Margaret suggested that the palace might consider some form of posthumous recognition for Eleanor. Perhaps a formal apology and a place in the palace's historical records as an example of moral courage. As the meeting concluded, Queen Camilla asked James to walk with her in the palace gardens. They needed to talk privately, away from advisors and officials. James agreed, his heart pounding. They walked slowly along the gravel paths, surrounded by carefully manicured flowers and ancient trees. The Queen apologized for her reaction during the inspection, explained that it had nothing to do with him personally, and expressed her gratitude that Eleanor's pin had brought the truth back to light. James listened, overwhelmed by the gravity of what his great-grandmother had experienced and what was about to happen next. 3 days later, the palace released an official statement that shocked the world. Queen Camilla announced that she would be giving a televised interview to discuss the incident at the guard inspection and to share a personal story that she had kept private for over 50 years. The announcement sparked immediate global interest. News organizations cleared their schedules. Royal commentators prepared their analysis. Social media erupted with speculation. Nobody knew what the Queen was going to say, but everyone sensed it would be historic. The interview was scheduled for the following evening in one of the palace's private sitting rooms. A respected journalist known for sensitive reporting was chosen to conduct it. The room was arranged simply, with 2 chairs facing each other and soft lighting that created an intimate atmosphere. Queen Camilla had spent hours preparing, working with advisors on what she would say and how she would say it. But ultimately, she had decided to speak from the heart. To tell her story in her own words without a script, When the cameras began rolling, the Queen looked directly into the lens. She greeted the viewers and thanked them for their interest. She acknowledged that the incident during the guard inspection had been unusual and concerning, and that people deserved an explanation. Then she began to tell her story. She spoke about being a young woman in 1973, about attending a party at the palace, about being assaulted by a powerful man. Her voice wavered slightly, but she didn't stop. She described Eleanor Hartley, the brave maid who had intervened and tried to help. She explained how the palace had covered up the incident, how Eleanor had been dismissed and silenced, how she herself had been told to forget about it. She described carrying that trauma for decades, undergoing therapy, building a life despite the pain. She talked about seeing the forget-me-not pin and how it had instantly transported her back to that terrible night. She explained that her reaction during the inspection had been pure trauma response, an involuntary emotional breakdown triggered by a painful memory. She apologized to Private James Mitchell for directing that response at him when he had done nothing wrong. The journalist asked careful questions, allowing the Queen to share as much or as little as she was comfortable with. Camilla spoke about the culture of silence that had existed in the 1970s, how victims of assault were often blamed or dismissed, how institutions protected powerful men at any cost. She acknowledged that the palace's handling of her assault had been wrong. She stated clearly that Eleanor Hartley had been treated unjustly and deserved recognition for her courage. She announced that the palace would be issuing a formal apology to Eleanor's family and would be establishing a fund in her name to support survivors of sexual assault. The interview lasted nearly an hour. Queen Camilla spoke about healing, about the importance of breaking silence, about how trauma can remain buried for years before being triggered by unexpected reminders. She talked about the therapy that had helped her cope and encouraged other survivors to seek help. She expressed hope that by sharing her story, she might help other women feel less alone in their experiences. She acknowledged that her position of privilege had allowed her to survive and eventually thrive. While many survivors did not have access to the same resources, when the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. Social media filled with messages of support and gratitude. Survivors from around the world shared their own stories, inspired by the Queen's courage. Mental health organizations praised her openness about trauma and therapy. Women's advocacy groups called it a watershed moment. Of course, there were also critics. Some accused her of seeking attention. Others questioned her timing. The family of the deceased man released a statement denying the allegations. But the overall response was powerfully positive. James watched the interview from the barracks, surrounded by his fellow guards. When Queen Camilla mentioned Eleanor by name, calling her a hero, James felt tears stream down his face. His great-grandmother's story was finally being told. Her courage was finally being recognized. The forget-me-not pin that she had treasured in silence was now a symbol known around the world. James's mother called him immediately after the broadcast ended. She was crying too, but they were tears of pride and relief. Eleanor's silence had been broken at last. In the days following the interview, the palace received thousands of letters addressed to Queen Camilla. Many were from survivors sharing their stories and thanking her for speaking out. Others were from people who had witnessed injustices and felt guilty for not speaking up. Some were from young women who felt empowered by the Queen's courage. The palace staff worked around the clock to catalog and respond to the messages. It became clear that the Queen had touched something deep in the public consciousness, had given voice to a pain that many people carried. The palace held a private ceremony to honor Eleanor Hartley. James and his family were invited, along with senior royal staff and members of the royal family. Queen Camilla gave a speech praising Eleanor's character and courage. She presented James with a framed letter of apology from the royal household, acknowledging the wrong that had been done to his great-grandmother. She also announced that Eleanor's name would be added to a memorial wall in the palace that honored staff members who had shown exceptional service and integrity. King Charles spoke as well, acknowledging that institutions like the monarchy had often been complicit in covering up abuses of power. He pledged that the royal household would implement new policies to protect staff members who reported misconduct, ensuring that nobody would ever again be punished for doing the right thing. He announced funding for training programs about trauma, consent, and institutional accountability. He made it clear that the royal family was committed to learning from past mistakes and creating a culture of transparency and justice. James was asked to say a few words. He stood nervously in front of the small gathering, holding the forget-me-not pin in his palm. He talked about his great-grandmother, about her kindness and strength, about the quiet dignity with which she had lived her life. He said that he wished she could have lived to see this day, to hear her courage acknowledged, to know that her silence had not been in vain. He thanked Queen Camilla for her bravery in telling the truth. He said that both women, separated by decades and by social class, had shown him what real courage looked like. The ceremony concluded with the planting of a forget-me-not garden in a corner of the palace grounds. It would serve as a permanent reminder of Eleanor's story and of the importance of speaking truth to power. James was given a cutting from the first plant, which he promised to grow in his own garden. As everyone stood around the newly planted flowers, there was a sense of something having been completed, a circle closed after 50 years. The truth had finally been told, and though it had come at a cost, it also brought healing. Months later, James continued his service as a royal guard. He wore the forget-me-not pin on every inspection with the full approval of his superiors. It had become a symbol not of scandal, but of integrity and courage. Tourists would sometimes point to it and ask about its significance, and James would tell them Eleanor's story. Queen Camilla recovered her composure and returned to her royal duties. But she often spoke publicly about trauma and healing. The incident that had seemed so shocking and inexplicable had become a catalyst for important conversations about power, silence, and justice. The story of that morning in the courtyard, when Queen Camilla lost control and spitted a royal guard, had transformed from a scandal into something much more meaningful. It had become a story about how trauma can remain hidden for decades before suddenly surfacing. It had become a story about institutional cover-ups and the courage it takes to challenge them. Most importantly, it had become a story about two women separated by time and circumstance, both of whom had been silenced and both of whom finally had their voices heard. The forget-me-not pin that Eleanor had treasured in secret had indeed served its purpose. The truth had not been forgotten, and now it would be remembered forever.